And I'm Kyle Thompson.
And you're listening to General Intellect Unit. And this week we've got a bit of a special episode and a bit of a change of pace. We're going to be taking a retrospective over the last, 32 episodes, I think, by now. I think this is the 33rd episode. Why are we doing this? I think it... partially because we know that, there's a lot of material, right? We've produced a lot of stuff, and we're aware that we have the listeners that are getting on board now, and potentially going back to episode 1 and starting from there is kind of daunting. So to give you a bit of an overview of the series so far, and also to tie together some threads and some themes that have been developing in the background over time, and that in the normal run of an episode we never get to tie together because we're always running up against the time limit with just the material we have to cover, and there's no room for digressions,
Yeah.
So in preparation for this, I went back over the notes for some of the episodes, and I realized that I'd lost the notes for some of the episodes because they were on paper, and I threw out the notebook. So it's a bit spotty, but I also listened to some of the very first episodes again, and ooh boy, that first one is a real mixed bag. It's it gets good, but by easily the slowest start to a podcast I've ever heard. Just so much dead air in the first 10 minutes, and so much just sleepy kind of dialogue, and just not no energy whatsoever for the first 10 minutes.
Well, I mean, to be fair, I think that was when we were still starting, so that I was getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning to record. So I think that may have something to do with my lack of energy.
But I mean, it does get good, right? It does actually get good.
Yeah.
I was struck with that episode, episode 001, podcast of the Cybernetic Marxists. It's remarkable how much of the show is there in the first episode, right? And how many of the themes are present. And we sort of nailed the opening of it, really. Yeah. I think we've had a pretty consistent vision for what this podcast is about, and we've picked our readings and we've picked our guests according to what we wanted to do at the beginning here, and I think that has worked quite well. This is not a podcast about, for the most part, day-to-day political back and forth, right? It is not a podcast about what is the best form of political engagement, right? Generally speaking, and it is not a podcast about every possible concern to Marxists or to systems theorists or anything like that. It has quite a bit of focus to it, and I think it benefits from that. Yeah, it does. I think certainly. Remembering back, how much of that was deliberate, and because I know we don't touch much on current event stuff, and I wonder how much that was a deliberate choice and how much of it is just an artifact of the way we record the show, right? We have such a long backlog. There's no point in making contemporary references.
Well, I mean, from what I remember, that was deliberate. That was a deliberate choice, because there are many podcasts out there that cover those things, right? I'm not saying it's bad to cover those things. I'm just saying, what's the point in us doing it, right? We are both very busy with our work and certainly don't have the resources to keep up with the discourse. And it's I think we both kind of came into it with this idea of doing more sort of background work.
Yeah. And I'm definitely glad we did, because now that I'm thinking about it, that was a deliberate thing, because I follow a lot of left podcasts and stuff, and it's it's nice to have a diversity of sort of viewpoints on the same subjects, but then like when something happens, you know, a sort of major event or an election or a whatever, some sort of world event, and then every goddamn podcast is doing the same episode that week, it's kind of like, oh, okay, I can stomach 4 of these, but the fifth one is going to be a bit hard to kind of pay attention to.
Sure.
So yeah, it's nice. It's nice to have this. This focus particularly on the sort of fusion of technology and sort of technical stuff with the socialist politics, which is a very, touching back on what we're supposed to be talking about, it's a very strong theme in the first episode, right? And particularly kind of like we sort of started out with this program of like trying to push back against this apolitical, you know, in quotes, sort of techie stance that you get amongst technical folks, right? That like, oh, I'm not political, I'm just a programmer, that kind of shit. It's like, no, dude, come on.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that like obviously I certainly came to that to some degree from my time as a student of Feenberg, but I think for both of us that was something that was really inspired by our kind of very concrete day-to-day experiences with tech and tech people, right? Like that this show, you know, generally isn't super engaged in day-to-day stuff and may seem a little bit sort of abstract and academic at times, but like I think that was very clearly coming from lived experience for both of us.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely, like for me, it's like because I went from kind of left organizing to kind of getting out of that for a while and kind of getting into technology and kind of taking up, like wearing that kind of sort of liberal techie hat for a while, and then being kind of like consistently put off by a lot of what I was seeing and a lot of the discourse I was hearing, and then kind of, you know, over the course of years working up to this point where it was like, you know, bad enough that I had to start a show about it. You know?
Yeah.
But yeah, having lived that, like, and you know, it's a damn shame, like, because you know, people that really should know better, and like, you know, that's too judgmental, right? Like, it's more that like we should get to a position where, you know, people who work with technology and people who design technology and people who do all this sort of stuff are in a more sort of educated position about these kind of issues. So that's just recasting it, not so much as a personal failing as a systemic failing. But yeah, all that's there in the first episode. And the other sort of big theme as well that like we stick to is that the future is contingent, right? That like it's not determined. Like this technical determinism that you get out of techie folk and just a lot of people in general. Like we even talk about this in the first couple of episodes, that like a lot of this sort of Silicon Valley kind of ideology has just seeped into the general culture, like everywhere in the world, and is now just kind of the default. So when we're critiquing the Silicon Valley stuff and the Californian ideology, we're really actually kind of taking aim at just the general contemporary kind of culture that, like, you know, celebrates Uber and all that other shit as just like an unmitigated sort of good, and you know, all that sort of stuff.
Definitely. Like, I think that is where the show has had a lot of resonance. Is that this culture, the Californian ideology, such as it is, has become very generalized, and so it's of interest to a lot of people, even if they're not necessarily directly in tech. The tech touches many parts of their lives, and I'm sure we're going to get into a lot of this discussion when we get to talking about platform capitalism. But
that's the next one.
Yeah.
But again, like a big feature of that kind of ideology is this determinism, right? That like, you can't do anything about surveillance capitalism. It's just inevitable, right? Like, you can't do anything about disempowerment of workers. That's just inevitable. It's like, no, get out of here with that shit. It's fucking crazy. And it took us a while to get back to that, right? Like, it was like 27 episodes later with like the Transforming Technology series that we finally nailed down the exact reasons why that is wrong. But that's it's all sort of present here initially.
Right. Yeah. Like, I think that we could have started there, but I feel like getting the context in that first part of the series was valuable, because we could read through a dense book like Transforming Technology and talk about the sections that we wanted to talk about, and the concepts that Feenberg brings up, but relate them to examples that we had developed and talked about on the show. So like, it wasn't we benefited from having something outside of that like narrow technical philosophical background, because I feel like on its own that is a pretty rough start to a podcast.
Yeah, definitely. That's an interesting way of putting it, right? That like, because like one of the themes I've definitely noticed is that for the first how many episodes, like 20 or so, or definitely up through episodes 10, 11, and 12, which were all watched over by Machines of Loving Grace. Up through then, like, it's all critique, right? Like, it's all kind of very negative. Right. And it's not until we get to the cybernetic brain with like episode 18 and 19 that we start to get anything that really resembles a positive program, right? And because I have this like constant kind of imposter syndrome and performance anxiety and stuff, like in one way that seems like it feels as if we were initially kind of floundering in a way, but no, I like your take better, right? Where like it's that we had to establish all these problems initially to have things to refer back to when we got to the positive stuff. Yeah,
I think that was definitely a part of the process, and I had read The Cybernetic Brain, I guess it was 2 years before we started the podcast. So the ideas in there were not new to me per se, but when we did finally get to that book and reread the sections that we did read, I think I definitely got more out of it because of the previous discussions we'd had. Like in my PhD, I read tons and tons and tons and tons of material about like all of the things that we're talking about in this podcast, but I didn't have the discussions that we had on this show, and I think that was really what gave me a new perspective, and I think those were very valuable to have in mind when we were approaching that book.
Yeah, interesting. So yeah, I guess like moving on a small bit, second episode, Four Futures, which I still think of as the first real episode because it's the first time we're actually reading something. That was a fun little book, and it reinforces that theme of like being against determinism, right? That like the future in particular is an outcome of struggles and choices, right? Like that it's not set in stone. And for listeners who haven't gone back that far, it's a sort of like schema for the future where it's like if you plot these two axes of like hierarchy versus equality and plenty versus scarcity, you get these kind of four squares. So like one is communism, socialism, rentism, and exterminism, and it's kind of an exploration of what those different futures might look like based on those kind of contingent outcomes. There's some stuff in there that we never really get back to, or we touch on very briefly, like stuff like the universal basic income, which was like that was kind of looming pretty large in my thoughts when we started the show, but it just hasn't been a theme at all, really.
Yeah, we haven't really talked about UBI too much subsequently, and I think that may be because of the focus of this show, which is less on kind of like all-purpose, general, sweeping social reforms, like the UBI. I think we kind of came back to that when we were talking about those or the labor. What was it, like a white paper that we did?
Yeah, so like episode 13 with alternatives, which was the labor white paper, and then I think we touch again on it in episode 15, technology and the worker, because it comes up there a couple of times.
Right. So I mean, it's in the conversation, but again, I feel like this is not an economic, or it's not an economics podcast, right? So it's not a public policy podcast. It's not a policy wonk podcast, and so our amount of engagement with that is always going to be somewhat limited, right? Like,
it's a big old nerd podcast instead. This is like the hardcore systems theory sort of stuff. that's more our sort of thing, right? Just obscure mid-century cybernetics books.
Well, I mean, like it is that, but it is also more than that, right? Like it is engaged in a way that I used to listen to a lot of coding podcasts, right? You listen to something like Functional Geekery. Right, like that's a podcast that is purely about programming languages and information theory and basically functional programming, and we're not that, right? Like we are not apolitical, technical, decontextualized in the way that sort of show is. And I really, like, if we ever become that, then
the show's fucking over at that point.
Then I'm done. I'm out. Yeah.
Absolutely not. No. It's a show that's all about synthesis, right? Like we're always synthesizing something. I think that's the strong theme throughout all of the episodes, really. Yeah. Yeah. Episodes 3 and 4, Blade Runner 2049. Pretty fun, fun movie and fun episodes. Like we touch back on it occasionally, but it doesn't loom incredibly large in the sort of mythos of the show. One thing I noticed though is that we spend a fair bit of those episodes, obviously because the film leans on it pretty heavily, but that kind of like Baudrillardian simulacra sort of stuff. And we never really get back to it, and it's hard to say whether we should. But I think back around then when we were recording that stuff, I was more starting to think about we should do Society the Spectacle, we should do this sort of stuff, and I'm not sure I think that anymore. I don't know that that's a sort of avenue that's as pressing to explore. I don't know. Like, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think that I think maybe one reason why we haven't gone in that direction is because Baudrillard's analysis is like fundamentally pessimistic, and we've tried to kind of create more, not necessarily like optimism, but at least openness in our thinking. And we've tried to bring in these theories that are about this kind of like ontological openness and all that sort of thing. And Baudrillard is really not about that.
He's not that. Yeah, he's not that at all.
I mean, like, would I say that Baudrillard's theories are inapplicable in the, media circus spectacle hell world that we live in? Of course, they have some applicability, right? Of course, you could do that analysis, and I wouldn't say you're wrong to do it, right? Like, you look at, like, just so much of politics, and it is about the virtual. It is about simulacra. It is about the media. today. But yeah, it's not really. I mean, I often have the thought with this show that there may be something like somewhat Pollyanna about our work, right? That like we're coming from a place of like, yeah, like, you know, at least I can say, like, you know, my job has really run me into the ground again and again this last year. And I really personally feel the crunch and the sort of the oppressive nature of working in a capitalist system at a very personal level.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, I guess there is a certain amount of insularity about my current life, or the life that I've led over the last couple of years, that has allowed me to kind of talk about these somewhat more abstract or somewhat more blue sky kind of topics.
Yeah.
Right. And yeah, you know, I often think about, like, well, are we being too Pollyanna? Like, is this too divorced from how incredibly awful things actually are? But, you know, kind of take it or leave it. That's what the show is. And I'm glad that it's out there, at least. Like, I don't expect everybody to appreciate what we're doing or find that it speaks to them, but at least it has an identity, and I think there are people for whom it has been constructive.
Yeah, I agree. Like, I think the thought has crossed my mind as well that, like, perhaps we're a bit too Pollyanna, yeah, as you put it. But yeah, I think it's a sort of important antidote to the kind of miserableism that's so prevalent in sort of in Marxist thinking, right? Like the especially in this era, right? Like the kind of, well, I suppose another way to put it is that, like, I mean, Baudrillard was in one ways like the kind of Dante of our hell, right? Like mapping it out in its cartographies, right? Like, but like, I don't think there's as much use in everyone being that kind of Dante, you know, like just accounting for the, you know, once you've mapped hell a couple of times, it's kind of, there isn't maybe so much more to say about it, right? Like, but I think we do need this. I mean, I think that was also stuff that came up in the early episodes. We do need this kind of sense of positivity and of like utopian thinking, as kind of cursed as that word has become. That, you know, because if that's if that's not the case, right? Like if there is no way out of this thing, if there literally is no hope, like if Fingberg is wrong and industrial society can't ever be reformed, if there's no way to ever create socialism, then just why bother, right? Like we're wasting our fucking time with all of this stuff if that's the case, right? Like, and if you still persist, then you have to admit that there is a possibility beyond what we know, right? Like that it's that openness we were just talking about, right? The kind of ontological openness. Because if Baudrillard was right, or, you know, if this kind of like very very dour sort of miserable take, if that's just right, then yeah, we're wasting our time.
Yeah, and I think, like, you know, one thing that is very of the moment right now is you know, the kind of movement towards like solar punk. And that. I feel like, you know, I'm currently writing a game in that genre, and have been kind of thinking about it quite a bit. And, you know, it's obviously connected to that sort of optimism or openness that we have been trying to bring out on the show. And, you know, it's a fine line to tread between kind of exiting circular negative thought patterns that just reinforce our own oppression versus just engaging in denial about how awful this situation actually is. Right?
Certainly,
like that's a very difficult thing to do, and it's, I mean, we're all in a mourning process about our civilization and our entire way of life, right? Like there is so much of our politics and of our discourse right now that is completely out of touch with our actual circumstances. And how we go through that mourning process is going to be individual to each of us. But I hope that we are engaging with our moment through this work in the most honest way that we can.
I'd like to think so, and I hope that we haven't ever crossed into any kind of denialism. In the sort of like you're right that that is a tricky balance, right? Like it is a very tricky balance. It's something we have to keep an eye on constantly. I would hope. I don't think we have ever gone properly into kind of denial mode. And no, I hope we never did. Yeah. But it's I mean, I think mourning is a good way to put it, right? Like that is certainly what's going on here. But even I think that's instructive because like the processes of mourning have more dimensions to them than just sadness, right? Like there's more to it than simple negativity, and I think that's what we're trying to get to. There is like having sort of deeper critiques and having more sort of open, or having accounts of how things could be different, which is stuff that we get to in a couple of episodes. But episode 5, Californian Ideology, great episode. Check it out. I don't think we can do justice to it here. It's just great. Go back and listen to it. It's really really kicking the shit out of that kind of dumbass Silicon Valley kind of ideology and that kind of techno-optimism. The hollow, because like we've been talking about defending our own optimism, but the thing we're attacking there is this very hollow and contradictory, unanalyzed form of optimism of like, oh no, the internet, it's just going to be great. Technology is awesome. What are you talking about? Why are you being a downer? That kind of thing. So we really put the get some solid kicks in against that sort of stuff, which is fantastic. I
think we had a lot of things to say after many frustrating conversations in our past, and that reading certainly gave us a framework and a venue to work with. And this the California Ideology is directly cited in Platform Capitalism, and there will be certainly discussion about that. So I anticipate that material is going to come up again in the very near future.
Well, that's another recurring theme for the show, right? That like we tend to follow the citations and follow up on stuff, in both directions, right? Like because I think the reason we did California Ideology so early was because it was referenced by Curtis in All Watched Over, and it felt like it was kind of foundational before we got to that stuff.
That's a good point, and I feel like there's also a thing that we do at the beginning of this show, which is very much about revisiting the 90s. Obviously, our culture as a whole is revisiting the 90s right now. You go outside and you see people wearing fashion that could have been right out of 1993, right? But I think that because that was a formative time for both of us, and because it was such a formative time for the tech sector, it was kind of important to go back and talk about this stuff. And, the California Ideology is one of the most iconic texts critiquing that period. And so I think it was good to go back to, certainly, as a foundation, because you can go back and talk about like the pre-90s Silicon Valley, right? Certainly a thing we could do and might do in the future. But the tech boom of the 90s is really something that stands out in people's minds, including our own, of course. Yeah.
I mean, even like to give a bit of a preview for the upcoming episode on platform capitalism, like that book makes the case that like that tech boom of the 90s sets the tone for everything that comes after it.
Right, and I think that is accurate. Yes. Yeah.
So it was very much calling the key for by which tech will play from there on. This also is the genesis of like a recurring theme for the show, in that like we tried to record too much in one session and just like fucking flamed out completely. We were going to record the Californian ideology and the next one of flying cars and the declining rate of profit at the same time, because we thought, they're two pretty short like articles, and it's like, whoa, boy, dude, we have this awful habit of misjudging the amount of material that we have in front of us.
Yeah. Oh, well. It definitely happens.
Yeah. But Flying Cars is a good episode. It's it touches on a lot of stuff that will again, these are the recurring themes, right? That like in the early episodes we kick off stuff that'll come up again and again, but like the ones that stand out to me are this like this notion of like stagnation, like in the face of like everyone sort of believes that capitalism is still super dynamic and that technology is still accelerating and all that sort of stuff, but like a sober analysis of it says otherwise. And that also stuff like the insufficiency of markets, right, to deliver on big promises, right, that like it which would come up again later with the accelerationists and such, and that like capitalism just isn't as innovative as it thinks it is. So it's two episodes back to back that are like getting really solid digs in against this kind of like mainstream Silicon Valley sort of ideology, but from two different angles, and like those articles are separated by a decade at least, aren't they, or 20 years even?
Yes, yeah. So it's a fair bit of time. Yeah.
That's a good pair of episodes though. Definitely go back and check those out if you're just joining us now.
I feel like we refer back to that article a lot, or at least I do. Like, I'm constantly referring back to that article because it does make its point very strongly.
Episode 7, Alienation, it was a bit of a departure for like the format of the show, where we were, instead of reading a particular text, we were going over a particular topic, like Marxian theory of alienation. I think it's a solid episode, but it's not a format we come back to very often. So I don't know, what does that say about it?
Yeah, there may be. I mean, I think what it is that we may find the need to cover another topic like that again, but it's certainly difficult to provide a good account of a subject like that, and something I think we'll continue to do sparingly, because that it's not just that it's a lot of work, it's that there's only some subjects where we might feel qualified to give that kind of survey of the topic, right? So I know I was drawing a lot on my time in grad school and my studies there to sort of basically give a lecture on the subject of alienation and Marxism. And how many subjects could I give a lecture about? Well, there's probably quite a few, but how many of them are relevant to the show? It's kind of hit or miss. So, yeah, I think we might come back to it again. I just think it will be only if we really see like, oh, there's a gap here that we need to fill, right? Because we could have gone and talked about say the cybernetic brain right away, but I do, and like we could have talked about like xenofeminism right away, but
they wouldn't have been as good, right? Like if we did them that early, like they just wouldn't have been that good.
I think that background was valuable, because like as much as like xenofeminism comes out of the anti-humanist tradition, at least having a background of what Marxist humanism is or at least the sort of positive side of it, as opposed to the the side that really got severely critiqued, I think was valuable there. So yeah, I mean, I don't have anything at the front of my mind in terms of like, oh, this is a topic we absolutely have to cover. But it was a thing that was coming up again and again in discussion, but we hadn't really defined yet, right? And so that's where I think we felt the need to do a definitional episode like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It's very much a foundational sort of concept. It's just that there isn't that much to say about it right now. But it's solid episode. Go back and check it out. Actually, you know what? Go back and check them all out. even with that caveat at the top of the show, right?
Yeah, you've got all the time in the world.
They're all pretty good, right?
No, like for sure.
Episodes 8 and 9 read plenty. That was a fun read. But like. That was our first touch point with cybernetics, but I thought it was absolutely hilarious later when we got to interview Andrew Pickering, and he was like, "Nah, that wasn't really cybernetics." Like, okay,
it was a cybernetics, right? It was just not the one that he found interesting. Yeah.
Is there anything that jumps out at you for those episodes?
Oh boy, I mean, I think. I still think that book is really great. I think it's really good at communicating through example. Like, okay, again, I have the caveat that I added to that episode, which is like, Spufford read the same books that I read. So, like, I was impressed with his capacity to communicate very dry material about a historical era that has passed in fiction, and give these kind of very illustrative examples of these different aspects of the Soviet system in the book. But yeah, despite that limitation, which I acknowledge is major, right? Like, I'm not going to brush that aside to be like, oh, well, like reading stuff in translation and not really having any primary sources is no big deal, because it is a big deal. But from what I know and what I've read, like, I'm still very impressed with what he came up with and what he presented there. It's a really really fantastic book, and just. That those two chapters about the whatever it was, the big machine that they have to get for the factory, and the sabotage, and then how it's connected to Goss Planet. That's just fantastic writing. Like it just explains so much in this wonderful, just kind of comic tragedy story about the dysfunction of the system, right?
Yeah, certainly. I think the other sort of thing to touch on here is that it's an example of that sort of optimism that we were just talking about. Like, it's the first time we were seeing, like, the whole background to it is an attempt at a rational economy, right? Like, as far off the rails as it ends up going, there are those early chapters that do a very good job of putting across just how daring that attempt was, and how the people sort of involved in the early days really sort of felt the pressing the need for that mission, right? And it gives us some glimpse of, like, I mean, if we're not wasting our time, then we have some plan or some pretension to want to do something like this again, right? Like a cybernetically rational economy, or a future that is very different from the one we know now, right? Having a historical example of that is reassuring, even if it ends up in those later two chapters where everything's kind of fucked up, like extremely fucked up.
This is sort of a thing that, like, Curtis brings up in hyper-normalization, but there are sort of parallels you might draw between that moment of crisis for the Soviet system and the moment of crisis that we find ourselves in now. and that sort of that sense of dislocation. You know, I think I get this a lot less in my everyday life, but whenever I go to like a conference, like an academic conference, or when I'm talking to people who are sort of very invested in the system or the way it operates, or, you know, just have some stake in this kind of like general conceptual level of how our society is organized, there's this incredible sense of dislocation, this incredible anxiety that people have, this sense that like the bottom has fallen out. There is, you know, basically nothing holding up this edifice anymore. Right, and especially when you go and talk to academics, right? In that kind of situation, we do have to think boldly and in a very exploratory way. And it's good to look back at this kind of example, right? Like, you know, that's one of the reasons why the book became so popular in the first place, was that it was a follow-up on the 2008 crisis, right? Like, people were like, well, you know, obviously, like, the 2008 crisis called into question our entire organization as a civilization, and then, you know, this is a book about a similar sort of topic.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Really good stuff. Well, that brings us on to episodes 10, 11, and 12, where we do this monster 3-part series on the documentary series All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, which was a big sort of project for us, right? To look at this thing. It's a real fucking downer, right? Like it's this like catalog of these instances of the bad kind of systems thinking, right? All these dreams of like using technology to stabilize the world and to create, you know, a networked world that would be stable forever, all this sort of stuff. You know, like the 90s boom, and it's like, you know, the proliferation of computers giving the illusion of stability, which allows banks to make much more dangerous loans than they should have, which leads to a fucking collapse, all this kind of stuff. And then you have like part 2 with its like where he gets onto like critiquing cybernetics and like the sort of the American cybernetics very, very harshly, and the, you know, the problems of the notion of ecology and of thinking of the world as if it were a machine and all this sort of stuff, right? But like this was a hard set of episodes because like we're fond of a lot of those ideas, right? But like they turn out in this package to be the components of a catastrophic result, right? Like It's all like, I think I can't really think of a better way to put it, but it's just the bad kind of systems thinking. And I think that's what plants it in our minds that we have to come up with something that is a strong counter argument to, or at least subconsciously, right, to come up with a strong counter to this.
Yeah. And you're absolutely right. We see in that series so much of where this stuff can go very wrong. And it is very pessimistic. And it was interesting. I think Curtis did an interview recently with, what was it, The Economist or Financial Times?
The Economist, I believe, yeah.
The Economist, yeah. And the tone of the discussion was, it felt almost a little bit more optimistic than what you usually see from him. So
maybe he's turning a corner.
I don't know. I mean, yeah, maybe there's something different going on. Maybe there's a change in his perspective, because I mean, maybe it was just because he was put opposite some shithead from The Economist, but I felt like it just seemed like a different tone, and I don't know, maybe he'll do something interesting in the near future that we'll be able to cover and sort of revisit his work and maybe talk about what we've come to think of in the time since we covered All Watch Over.
Yeah, sure. I wonder if we can get him on the show. That'd be amazing.
Yeah.
I'd probably be stunned if that happened, but still. So I guess we can sort of like... there's a lot of themes there that I think we'll maybe come back to in a short while when we get to the cybernetic brain, because that's where we get to this kind of like positive counter argument, or at least just like stuff to contrast it with, because like there's one thing in the notes here that I kind of want to mention. There's like this one thing that Curtis like harps on constantly is this like these people in the documentary, and like the people he's accounting for, like they have this really narrow over application of a machine metaphor to like nature is a machine. This MacBook in front of me is a machine. Therefore, nature is a MacBook. You know, that sort of really dumbass kind of like narrow frame of thinking, and that's in stark contrast to, say, Stafford Beer, you know, who we'll get to in the cybernetic brain, and like my other sort of favorite thinkers like Deleuze and Guattari, who have this like extremely open version of a machine or system ontology that is so much more rich and vibrant and dynamic than the kind of I can only describe it as narrow machine thinking that came over these folks, you know.
And it was quite interesting because I've been working on this paper on and off about governance and games, I just came across this factoid that if you remember, there was the one guy that was on the show talking about like early warning systems, and then how his ideas sort of informed the Club of Rome.
The guy with the dumb name, Buckminster Fuller. Is that him?
No, not Buckminster Fuller. It was
Jay Forrester.
Yeah, Jay Forrester. So it turns out, like, I'm not 100% sure of this, but I got a pretty good. I did look it up, and turns out this guy wrote some stuff on urban planning, and that actually ended up becoming the inspiration for SimCity.
Woo! Fantastic. Oh boy.
Yeah, I was like, wow. Yeah, like, because I mean, you know, I think as screwed up as like a ton of the assumptions about urban planning are in SimCity, I think it still informs a lot of people's ideas of like how cities are planned, right?
Being from Ireland, I never got the impression our cities were planned. But yeah, for the American context.
Right. That's a good point. That's a very good point. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah,
especially like living in Edinburgh, that's especially the case as well. But yeah, like that's definitely a thing, right?
Oh yeah, totally. It's a very American game, right? That's an excellent point. That you know, the sort of assumptions that are baked into that game are very much of the American mold.
Yeah.
But you know, it's just interesting to see that, like, you know, this guy's ideas were not just Club of Rome ecology stuff, but actually, you know, were like a direct inspiration for this artifact of my childhood, and like basically the game that came to define all city builders that preceded it. Yeah, I mean, that's this very sort of like popular systems thinking that's out there in the world. And if anybody wants to sort of dive into that a little bit more, there is I think an episode of Three Moves Ahead on the latest expansion of City Skylines, and they get into that discussion quite a bit in there, and it's quite interesting.
That's cool. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, all watched over. Those 3 episodes are I think great episodes for our show. Definitely check them out. Episode 13, alternatives, and this was me continuing from, you know, episode 7, Alienation, and then later we'd get an episode called Accelerate. I was trying to keep the one-word episodes to always begin with A, if I could. I'm not sure that pattern will hold, but it'd be nice if I could keep that joke going. Well, it's
New Year, you gotta switch it up. Go to B now.
Yeah,
that's a real challenge.
That was a fun episode in that, like, we read a paper from or commissioned by the Labour Party of the UK, and we read a piece from David Graeber and Wengrow about it's sort of an odd piece about, like, human history, right? Like, and how our assumptions about how we transitioned from early societies to, like, agriculture are actually kind of really quite wrong. But it's this theme again of, like, the possibilities for societal formations are much wider and more malleable than we expect them to be, which is that kind of Pollyanna kind of point again, right? Like, well, yeah, things can be good, you know, or at the very least things can be different, right? That's what we were getting to there.
yeah.
Yep. Yeah, that was fun. Episode 14, Markets in the Name of Socialism. I think that one sticks out in my memory as possibly being. I think. Look, I'll preface this by saying I think it was a really good read and some really good stuff in there. I think it's one of the worst trade-offs in effort to episode duration that we've ever had, because, like, that was an enormous book, and it took a lot of effort to read it in time to record.
It was a grind. It was like that is like, of all the prep that we did,
that's the high watermark for fucking prep, right?
Yeah, in the run of the show, like, that is the one I remember. I have, like, vivid memories of, like, where I was sitting down, where I was reading. And just you know, chatting with you about the grind of getting through that book. It was really intense, and, you know, the thing that really sticks out to me about that book is that period when the project of neoclassical socialism is going off the rails, and everybody realizes that something is wrong, and they don't quite know what to do, and it's just before the collapse of their entire society, right? And, like, that, like, as dry as that book is, and as sort of, like, laden with the burden of academic history writing it is, that moment still very much just stays with me. That story stays with me. I think about it very often when I think about where we're at as a society right now.
Well, yeah, I mean, like, I was just going to say, like, I mean, it sticks with you because it reminds you of something, right? Like, something very immediate. But it also, like, one of the lessons to take away from that is that, like, you won't recognize the collapse of your society coming. You know, like, being moments away from just the fucking end of what you've known. You're not actually aware of it, right? Like, so I get this haunting feeling that we're presently, you know, as of whatever fucking January of 2019 this is, you know, in a similar sort of position. I mean, it's hard to know about timeframes, right? But yeah, I don't know. Definitely get the very similar kind of vibes, right?
Yeah. There's definitely a similar sense of dislocation and political disarray that we find ourselves in and, like, I think it was worth looking at that because the stories of Yugoslavia and Hungary in particular are very, like, unknown and underappreciated for most people. Like, I think that, you know, people know about Yugoslavia because of the Civil War, but they don't really have much sense beyond that of what that story was, right? Like, and so it was really interesting to visit that and talk about it, even though I'm certainly not an expert, just because there was a lot of optimism and experimentation in that society that is maybe something we aspire to, and so certainly something that, like, as the book suggests, something that did influence our history, right? Like, our history of neoliberalism was informed by those experiences in ways that we probably don't appreciate. And I don't know. Yeah, it's a really interesting historical episode, and it's just kind of a shame that the book really suffers from its format and like is just really not that enjoyable of a read outside of those few sort of moments of brilliance that you run across. I mean, I agree, and I think I would put it in a sort of like positive sense of like I would actually like to read that again, but in a different format, like in a completely rewritten to be like a 150 page sort of zero books publication size. Absolutely.
I would actually really like to see that again, because it was a bit of a slog to get through, but turned out to be a pretty sweet episode. Episode 15, Technology and the Worker, was pretty cool as well. Finally getting back to like tech sector organizing and technology in the workplace, which is that's another one of these things of like it took us 15 episodes to get there, but that was a good one.
Oh yeah, and it did feel like something that we we should have gotten to earlier, and I was really glad when we did get there. That was an enjoyable episode to record, and very I appreciate all of the specificity of what we addressed in that episode, like many very specific things that relate to like actual dilemmas and opportunities and possibilities in the tech sector, related to workers organizing. And like, that was really good to cover. I don't know what to say beyond just like go back and listen to it because it's still relevant.
It's great. Yeah, it's very much still relevant. It's also, we were reading material that was contemporary at the moment that we recorded it, so that was kind of cool as well. Definitely check it out. It's a current that I think we would like to do a bit more of going forward. Like we have done more of that tech worker organizing stuff, but we don't have any plans to drop that thread. Episode 16, an intersectional analysis of geoengineering, where we had our first guest, Tina Sicca. Really, really fun episode, and like I think we should definitely do more guests. I mean, we do have even more guests from here on out, but this is. That was a really, really interesting episode. I think it was particularly interesting because it was stuff that we wouldn't necessarily have gotten around to without Tina's input, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this episode, the subject matter of this episode, specifically talking about how like the impact of technological implementations can be various according to like your background and degree of marginalization, really reminded me of like some of the things that I saw at the symposium on the Anthropocene that I went to in 2018, end of 2018. And there's definitely like a lot of sort of like valuable thinking there about like I think this gets back to our discussion about coordination versus flexibility, right? And I think it's really important to keep these kinds of considerations in mind when thinking about approaches to dealing with the challenges of our time, right? Like geoengineering is like a potential maybe kind of solution to the massive problems that we're facing. Like not really, but
solution
like,
in big fucking quotes, right? Like
it's in big quotes, but it doesn't. It's certainly like I think that the thing that this paper or this chapter was getting at really was that that kind of like all-encompassing response doesn't really have that flexibility, right? It doesn't have the requisite variety to deal with the variety of people's lived experiences, right? And I think that's a really interesting avenue of thought. So I look forward to seeing more of that.
Or even to like to touch on, because I think we're making allusion to the immediately prior episode on inherent instability of disordered systems. Like disadvantaged folks don't have requisite variety to challenge such an enormous scale project either, right? Like that the lack of organization really harms people who have already been harmed, you know.
It very much there is a deep inadequacy in both ways. Both of the policy solution and also of the means that for example, a Indian peasant has to cope with the consequences of geoengineering.
Great episode. I mean, I'm wrapping up every one of these sections with like great episode, check it out. But like, great episode, check it out. Episode 17, The Dispossessed with Fraser. That was another really great one, and the first work of fiction that we've tackled.
Well, aside from Red Plenty, right?
Oh fuck yeah, that's right. Is it fiction? You know, no, it is. Yeah. Why do I keep forgetting that?
It's historical fiction, right? It's historical fiction.
Yeah, but like there's something to it where that like. Yeah, I completely forgot that was fiction. I don't know. Yeah, weird. But yeah, just The Dispossessed was fun. Like really, again, this theme of like very real possibilities for living differently, right? Is the sort of one of the major themes of that book.
Yes. I mean, it is a fantastic book. Just really amazing. One of the best books I've ever read, for sure. And that one sticks with me for a lot of reasons, both because it's such a good book and also because it was just so difficult to get through for me. It was rough, but I really am glad that we recorded the episode. I'm really glad I got a chance to read it, and I look forward to doing more of Le Guin's work on the show because I'm continually impressed with the quality of her writing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just incredible work. I think what was it we thought we would do? Like, was it The Left-Handed Darkness or something?
Yes,
but
that's right.
We'll get around to that, I'm sure, at some point. It was nice to take a break to do something fictional, right? Like to have a bit of elbow room or a bit of leg room to just stretch out and kick back, you know. And Fraser's a great guest as well.
I feel like your experience of the book was rather different than mine.
Oh yeah, you were in a big rush.
It felt more like I don't know, just it was bad. It was I had major PTSD flashbacks from grad school reading that book, and it was really difficult to get through, to the point that I didn't read the whole thing until afterwards, right? I definitely appreciated the change of tone of moving to something that was like just straight up science fiction. I think probably our experiences were very different of that. Yeah,
definitely. But this brings us on to episodes 18 and 19, where we read The Cybernetic Brain. This definitely feels like the tentpole of the show, right? Like it is. No, because let it not be the tentpole, because that would mean it would be the halfway mark, and that would mean we'd only have another couple of episodes to go before it inevitably ends. But it's certainly one of the central pillars on which the whole thing stands, right? Like that was an incredible read, like absolutely incredible. And it's here that we finally get to the good kind of systems thinking and cybernetics.
Sure, yeah.
And this is what gives us this kind of ammo to counter the sort of dour horrible downer ending of All Watched Over. You know.
Yeah, I think it really did open up a lot of possibilities in terms of our thinking, and it's a really multifaceted book. I think it's one we continually refer back to as an inspiration and something that allows us to get that different perspective on the things that we discuss on the show. It's just very valuable. The sort of core ideas of the book are ones that I think about all the time. It's just. And I hope to read some more chapters of it in the future on the show, because it is really, really good.
Yeah, definitely. We should get onto some more of it. But some of the core ideas that really stand out for us are the kind of obviously the notion of adaptivity as being a primary concern. The notion of the adaptive brain or the adaptive mind as a kind of embedded, embodied phenomenon, rather than being something that's detached from the world, it's actually embedded in the world, and that flows into this performance or process ontology, this whole different way of looking at the world that's in kind of stark contrast to the what Pickering would say was the kind of modern scientific framing that we saw in the kind of the folks that were looked at by Curtis's documentary. So we're emphasizing here this kind of non-dualism, that the mind and body aren't actually separate, that advanced complex intelligent behavior emerges from complex organizations of matter. You get and from that you get these strange agencies, from assembled machines having agency that you wouldn't expect them to have. And the big one is the kind of unknowability of the world, right? And the kind of impossibility of total control. That kind of mathematically it is impossible to actually control the world. And there's something relieving about that. I find that you can just sort of, in one sense of we often squander a lot of time on epistemological sort of wankery about how do we know the thing? How do it's all pointless. What you actually need to focus on is performance and engagement, but also that attempts to control and to dominate are kind of and maybe this is one of these very Pollyanna sort of things, but those attempts to dominate and to totally control are kind of destined to fail ultimately, because the project is actually impossible. You can't do it, and it's we get onto that in the episodes as well about the kind of failures of modernity and say the war on terror, for example, as a kind of example of that, and an attempt to project domination onto a complex system that fails absolutely because that domination is actually impossible ontologically, at a sort of physical level, it cannot be done. That's it's reassuring in a way,
Yeah, I think that it is, and we're very much coping with this problem, as an entire civilization, right? One of the things that was brought up at the Anthropocene symposium that I went to was this idea of persistence. So looking at how long patterns of life are able to persist. So this is something, obviously connected to archaeology, to some extent to anthropology, but really it's an archaeological thing. And those persistent patterns. So, for example, one of the examples that was given was the design of a woven basket. That design may have persisted over hundreds, if not thousands, of years. Very, very slowly being reformed and changed, but basically adapted to its environment, right? Is useful in the environment and is also a part of a process of life that involves a kind of recurring stewardship of the environment, harvesting, production, and then the use of those that produced artifact in the environment itself. And that is certainly something that is viable. It is recurring. It is has a kind of homeostasis to it. And the important point that was being brought up there with relation to the Anthropocene was we since the beginning of the capitalist era, we have strove after this kind of total control, right? And we have produced artifacts and patterns of life that are incredibly scalable, right? That have come to dominate most of the globe, and in some ways are very powerful and effective. But it seems as though their capacity, their viability as persistent systems, is extremely poor. It is kind of inconceivable to me. In the first place, we have the idea of the product cycle and product innovation, right? That's just kind of it is a core of capitalism in terms of the revolutionizing of the means of production, but it has also become just kind of a core of capitalism in terms of the consumer product cycle, right? And the way that marketing works. And baked into that design is the assumption that persistence is kind of worthless. And when our sort of everyday artifacts, or the artifacts that that surround us in our life and form a part of the pattern of our life, are designed to be kind of hostile to persistence, that kind of has knock-on effects to our relationship to the rest of the world, or the general pattern of our life.
Yeah.
So I really feel like the presentation of control and complexity and viability that we see in the cybernetic brain as a sort of non-modern way of thinking does get at this sort of very material recurring pattern of life that we have that is probably not long for this world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Getting back to the thing we were talking about a bit earlier about the sense of impending collapse, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that the value here is that this introduces these terms, right, and these viability, Stafford Beer's notion of viable systems, about emergence and exceedingly complex systems. But it also gives us, and all that stuff about the sort of non-modernity and non-modern ways of thinking. It's really nice to see a critique of modernity that isn't just some reactionary bullshit. This is a positively framed critique of modernity, which it isn't just some Kaczynski fucking crank bullshit.
Yeah, and I think this is a major challenge that we have right now, is that this is certainly a tension that was very evident at the Anthropocene symposium I went to, which is that we have to reevaluate our fundamental values as a modern society. That is a fact of the situation we find ourselves in, both because of these ecological challenges we're facing, and also because of just our general social dysfunction. And that brings us into a place where we have to reevaluate our understanding of non-modern societies, right? Or non-modern social formations. For most of modernity, we've looked down on them as basically backwards, and they have the fundamental flaw that they cannot provide as much material wealth to their citizens as a modern society can, and they don't have the military force that a modern society can or has, right? And I think we have to reevaluate all of that right now, and that's what people are doing. But it is very easy in so doing to fall into sort of reactionary patterns of thought, sort of Malthusianisms, or limits to growth ideas, or just sort of like the uncritical valorization of village life or traditional life, and I think that we really need tools like we find in the cybernetic brain to conduct that reevaluation in a sort of careful way, and a way that may allow us to both enjoy some of the freedoms we have today, and maybe enjoy other freedoms that we don't have today, going forward, as opposed to saying, well, we just, need to go full on primitivist or whatever, or like, that, going back to Four Futures, that kind of, whatever, like, not exterminist, but like sort of the grimmest form of socialism you can imagine.
Oh yeah,
the kind of
socialism.
Like eco-Stalinism or something like that. Which is pretty much the specter that the right uses to scare people about climate change measures. Right? Is that like, oh well, the socialists are just going to take everything you have and force you to live on gruel at gunpoint to protect the environment, right? Yeah.
And it is crucial that we present like what we have here in the cybernetic brain of like a suggestion of a sort of beautiful future, right? Like because it's in the subtitle of the book, right? Sketches of Another Future, a non-modern future, as well as the crucial thing that it is forward looking. It is a positive program, and this is where I think we start to develop these notions of like a cybernetic politics, right? Like, or a navigational politics, or an adaptive and revealing politics that that just adopts these sorts of ideas, and that for us is still an ongoing research program that we're still grappling with, and it's not easy doing it in our spare time either, but we're getting there, and it does come up later in the show again, like when we get back to Stafford Beer. But this is definitely the point where we turn a corner, I think, in the show, like going from just like critique to like having something new to bring with us. Yeah, fabulous, really fabulous stuff. Like, check out those two episodes. The next one, episode 20, Yeoman Coders, is a pretty awesome discussion, I think, of the kind of labor relations of open source software. And it does touch back on the kind of Californian ideology stuff. I don't think there's an immense amount of stuff to say about it now, but it was a good episode.
Yeah, I think like there's enough detail there that it's worth just kind of going back and listening to it. But like really, it is about that topic of the way that open source presents itself and what actually underlies its functioning and what kind of labor relations it promotes. And that's something I had thought about for a very long time prior to recording that episode. And I think it's worth going to listen to.
Yeah. I think I would like to cover more of that sort of stuff in the future, but like I think the thing that struck me in building these notes for this episode was that like I don't like, you don't get much of that sort of particular analysis, right, that we could sort of base it off of, except for like the article that we did read for that episode as the jumping off point. But if the listeners know about any stuff that like rings that particular bell, then like let us know. We would like to read it.
Yeah. I think that's actually pretty cutting edge thinking right there that you see. And I expect there will be more of it, but yeah, it is quite rare.
But let us know if you're aware of any obscure stuff that we would like to read on that front. Episode 21, Accelerate, again, keeping with the A's. A brief history of accelerationism, which is something we had been asked to cover a couple of times, and we sort of go over the origins of this pattern of thought up through, from Deleuze and Guattari through Lyotard up through Land and the CCRU and Fisher. And then we sort of close off the episode with a read of the Accelerate Manifesto by Nick Cernishek and Alex Williams, which is more of like a left acceleration thing, which is like from what I can tell, like absolutely fucking derided in the sort of proper accelerationist Twitter sort of sphere. But then most of those people are dorks anyway, so I'm not too worried. That was a good read, I thought. The manifesto, like it explicitly calls for this navigational politics, an acceleration that is also navigational. Which I think we found pretty interesting, and we managed to synthesize some pretty cool thoughts out of that by combining it with the cybernetic brain.
And we'll be returning to Cernicek with platform capitalism very soon.
Yeah. The other sort of thing there is that it also reminded us a lot of flying cars, right? Where it's a similar argument that like capitalism as we know it now is kind of running on fumes off of like previous periods of dynamism, and that like in its current state it's actually very, very stagnant, and it ends up countering the sort of arguments of the sort of Landians about their sort of their obsession with like accelerated deterritorialization, that like capital as we know it right now is actually very re-territorializing and very stodgy, and there's a call there to kind of re-accelerate the process and break out of capitalism as we know it. However, in the end, it's not actually accelerationism, right? Like it's a different sort of thing that's being called for, but it's a thing we kind of like, you know. I mean, it's I think there's fertile ground there, and I think it's something we sort of do in the background for the rest of the show. Is we're sort of taking the best parts of that manifesto and combining them with the navigational stuff of the cybernetic brain, and that's a good episode, and that's stuff that's like, you know. But for 2/3 of the episode, we're in critique mode against the sort of mainline accelerationists, but then like there is a current of that thought that we quite like as well, and and I think that this kind of critique of capitalism as insufficient will, like, it seems to be sort of gathering steam. It seems to be getting some kind of popular traction these days, and I think, given that we're fairly certainly about to enter another financial crisis, I think in the aftermath of that, it will be another sort of moment where we'll have a very dismal recovery, and this kind of argument will have traction, right? It will be relevant. Yeah. Oh yeah, definitely. So to be totally clear, we're recording this in January of 2019, and like everything that we're seeing at the moment in the sort of business press is pointing towards an imminent recession. Or slowdown, or whatever you want to call it. So that's going to be super fun. It's probably going to happen by the time this comes out, or maybe not. Maybe everyone will have egg on their faces.
Who knows? It's hard to predict precisely, but I feel like within a year, maybe two, I think we're going to see some pretty dire events, financially speaking. But hey, I mean, I am no cheerleader for the stock market. I'm just, like everybody else, we all have to suffer the consequences of this way this system is organized.
Yeah, grim stuff. Anyway, episodes 22, 23, and 24 brought us on to another marathon 3-part series on Andrew Feenberg's book, Transforming Technology. Which I guess is another big pillar that we sort of stand on, right? Because this gives us the account of how and why it's possible to transform technical civilization, right? That it turns out that technology isn't neutral, but it's also not a alien evil force that cannot ever be bargained with. Like, it's not the Terminator. It's actually a thing that's like an entangled, complex phenomena. And again, it's this thing of like a big part of the value here is it introduces to new vocabulary, right? Like we get operational autonomy, the sort of the autonomy enjoyed by management, the autonomy to decide on what counts as good technology and bad technology in the sort of workplace, right? That's kind of crucial. The notion of a technical code as a sort of abstract coordinating logic that welds power to technology. pretty awesome.
Yeah, those are two really key concepts.
Yeah. I guess the kind of positive argument here, or the thing that we can take away, is that like we can transform technical society if you can transform the sort of interests that feed into the design of the technical infrastructure. If you change the technical code, right, like you can, because we operate in a particular kind of technical code that privileges one group of people over everyone else. You change the code to privilege everyone else, or to like alter the logic, then you can actually change society that way. We can't do justice to it here. Go listen to the episodes; they're fantastic. Yeah, it's a bit of a monster.
It's 3 episodes, so yeah. But yeah, I think that is the core takeaway, right?
Yeah. 25 gets us to a real wonderful interview with Andrew Pickering, of author of The Cybernetic Brain. Just great stuff. Absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, it was a pleasure.
Yeah. Skype was fucking horrific, though.
Oh boy,
Jesus Christ. Yeah, never Skype again. Oh boy.
Yeah, well, we had subsequent Skype troubles too, and yeah, I think we're gonna have to put our foot down on that one.
Yeah,
Skype is out of the conversation.
Worst codec ever. Like, oh my god, what it does to audio is just fucking terrible.
Well, it's just antiquated, right? Yeah.
But otherwise, like, great stuff, and it was wonderful to talk to Andrew. Then episode 26 brings us up to a sort of fun sort of reversal of or not a reversal of format, but a fun change of format as well, where it was a report back from a conference I attended, Metaforum, in November of 2018. But the Metaforum is a non-profit organization that's set up to continue the work of Stafford Beer. So I got to hang about for a couple of days with people who worked with Stafford directly, people who have been applying his ideas in business for however long. Unknowingly, I got to got to talk briefly with someone who was running Project Cybersyn at one point, and I only realized that after I left. I was like, "Oh God, that's that role." Okay, right. Now I know who it is. Wonderful, like really wonderful experience, and just fantastic.
Yeah, it was definitely interesting to hear your experiences, and I've been talking about this symposium that I went to, and the reason why I didn't do a similar episode about that was I wasn't able to attend the whole thing, so I feel like I couldn't really do it justice, but yeah, hopefully we'll have more of these sort of experiences in the future that we'll be able to report back on and kind of give people a sense of what sorts of gatherings are out there and what they might have to offer. I mean, it's pretty common in like coding podcasts to talk about, the conference circuit. And I don't think we're ever really going to be doing that exactly, but just giving that sort of report on what we did experience, I think, can have some value.
Mm-hmm, certainly. And I mean, I think there's also kind of more, there's more, I don't know, intellectual value in our sort of attending conferences about the Anthropocene and about Stafford Beer's work and cybernetics, and then reporting back on that, as opposed to like going to another fucking JavaScript conference.
Oh, of course, yeah. But I mean, that is. I feel like, that's. I'm not gonna. I'm totally not gonna be up here talking about the hot new framework you gotta learn. Get your coder boot camp right away.
But it would be great. I think it would be great to try to attend more of these sort of relevant conferences. And then, again, invite for the listeners, if you know of things that we don't know about, let us know. That's always a standing invitation anyway. But, cool. So where are we? Episodes 27 and 28 on xenofeminism with our guest, Kira McGran. Another excellent guest episode. Wow, like Jesus, it's so much. I love when we have guests on. It's just fantastic. I think it's also been good to get because obviously the xenofeminism thing is it explicitly a feminism, and touching on the intersection of like gender and technology and so on. Being able to talk about that, and also to get a guest that like complements our sort of perspectives and brings their own stuff to the table. Wonderful. It's a recipe for a great episode.
Yeah, it was a really good conversation. The only thing that sort of came up to me in the wake of this episode was there was this. We might have to link it in the show notes because I can't remember the exact title, but there was a essay that came out, I want to say like about month and a half, 2 months ago, and it was this very like searing critique of cybernetic feminism as like kind of like the problems of that Haraway style perspective when considering the experience of disabled people who actually, make use of prostheses on a regular basis, and that's just a practical part of their lives. So I think we might have to put that in the show notes. Like, I don't think it invalidates what we were saying there, but like it definitely gave me pause. Maybe we'll throw that in the show notes because it is a very good essay. It's very to the point, and it raises some real questions about how our culture thinks about like embodied cybernetics. So maybe we'll revisit that with an episode in the future. I can't guarantee it, but I feel like I'm not doing it justice even now. So sure. We might have to do that. I still definitely stand behind the discussion we had in xenofeminism in that episode because it was just such a great conversation with Kira, and it's well worth listening to.
Yeah. I think that what you just mentioned there sort of highlights something that's perhaps not explicit in the way we run the show, but is I think comes up a couple of times where we're not particularly, like in most cases, we're not particularly like emotionally attached to the sort of material we cover, so we are absolutely fine with scathing critiques of it. And like if somebody publishes a book that completely invalidates the cybernetic brain, we'll cover it. On the off chance that happens. But like, so yeah, that's well up our alley, and we're not going to like stand for any particular author or material that we cover. Like, and I think we've been like openly critical of stuff that we've read as well. In fact, we have the missing episode as well, where we were so critical of it we couldn't even bother to record the damn thing.
Oh, for sure, yeah. And I mean the criticisms that I read were subsequent to that episode, and like they were pointing out a blind spot, and that was definitely a blind spot that I had. Like it just was not really on my radar, I think it's very important to the way we think about cybernetics, and so we'll talk about that more in the future.
Sure, yeah, definitely. Episode 29, Player of Games with Fraser Simons again. Another fun book, another fun bit of fiction. It was nice to get into the Culture series of novels, particularly the touch point being that like you have these folks like Elon Musk and a bunch of other Valley dudes who are like, supposedly very influenced by the culture things, and it's like it's hard to see how, because they seem to miss the point entirely of the blistering sort of critique that Banks lays down against like capitalism and such. And it's like, have these people
amazing.
Read the book? Like, what the fuck?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing this week was like like AOC quoting Watchmen, and then like her critics being like, like totally unself-reflexively totally unaware, just utterly blind to what Moore was saying in that book, just being like, well, Rorschach is just like the coolest dude. Like, I mean, obviously he's just like my libertarian superhero, so like, what are you even doing talking about this guy?
I love that, because like how can you miss it? Because like there's the dead giveaway for me, because I read Watchmen when I was like a teenager, and I wasn't particularly smart, right? But like there's like within the first 4 pages there's that line where Rorschach is like, I'm going to tell the invulnerable man that somebody intends to kill him, and I was like, oh, this guy's a dumb piece of shit. That's what the character is like. It's so blindingly obvious. He's like, I don't know how people read this stuff and not pick up on it. But yeah, I mean, Player of Games is fantastic. Some of the sort of really interesting themes were like that, like structure matters and like language matters and technique matters, right? That like the protagonist is altered by their contact with a society that has such a radically different structure and a different way of speaking and a different way of like interacting with each other and with their built environment and such, that it actually does warp his mind eventually. Yeah, fantastic. And like especially the thing about like how power and systems are woven together was fabulous.
Yeah, totally. And I think there is actually, similarly, there's probably a huge discussion to be had about the way that disability is treated in that book. I kind of brought it up at the end of the discussion, but when I went back and thought about the book more and the way that, what's his name? The drone that
Flurim Saho or whatever. Or no, the bad drone.
Yeah. The bad quote of a bad drone. Yeah, the narrator.
Well, it ends up being the same person anyway, but.
Yeah.
Fuck it. We'll just call him the bad drone, whatever.
Yeah. The way that he frames his situation in terms of disability in the culture is actually really interesting and something we didn't really address as well as we might have. I think there's probably a full discussion to be had there.
Yeah. We took it on face value for what he was saying, that like, he feels as if he's been defanged or whatever. But that's like,
what does that mean in a society like the culture? I think is a big question that you can kind of get into a little bit more than we might, or than we did in that episode.
Great episode again. I did have one little bit I want to elbow in here, because I had it in my notes, and I remember I mentioned it in the episode that I intended to come back to this before we wrapped up, and I forgot to do it. But that like there's a really interesting bit like that. Like there's only 4 chapters in the book, like, or 4 sections, and the actual chapters aren't really numbered. But the last of them is called Machina Ex Machina, which is, the machine from the machine, and it's a play on this usual thing of like Deus Ex Machina. But in the language of Azad, like the empire that the protagonist goes to visit, Azad means machine or system. So what it's getting at here is that like it's the machine from the machine, the system from the system, and Azad from Azad. And that's exactly what they're doing, right? The game of Azad that they use to determine the emperor of the empire called Azad is an autopoietic system that's self-perpetuating, in that the play of the game conditions you to be this kind of tyrannical emperor figure, and that further conditions the next run around the loop. So I thought that was actually very clever. But it leans on the reader remembering this like little factoid from the beginning of the book that, in their language, Azad just means machine. Fabulous.
It's really cool, and I definitely look forward to doing Accession on the show. That's gonna be good. Because that is, I mean, especially in the moment that we're in right now, I am here for a book that is just the most searing burn on Tories ever found in a science fiction novel.
What do they call the affront or something?
The affront, yes, the affront. They're just like utterly offensive to every norm imaginable. Yeah. Yeah, and then there's that awful dude who's like, well, actually, they're pretty cool. Yeah, I mean, it is good. I enjoy many things about that book. I look forward to covering it.
Yep. So yeah, episode 30 then was an interview with Wendy Liu and Jason Prado about tech worker organizing, which was an excellent conversation. A lot of back and forth. We went dunking on open source software again. In that conversation too. Yeah, just excellent stuff. And like, I think like our guest episodes have turned out to be some of the better episodes of the show.
Yeah, and I think like there was a part in the conversation where I was sort of dismissing political solutions to the situation because I was just thinking about how terribly captured Californian politics is by the tech sector, or American politics in general. And Wendy sort of rightly corrected me at that point, and I really appreciated that.
Yeah, well, it's why we get smart folks on the show, right? Like as guests, because like we don't have sufficient variety to meet all these challenges, and we got to get clever people in.
Yeah, I mean, I've been out of politics for a very long time because I have been living in Japan. I don't have the franchise, and my residential status here is tenuous, but I'm sort of also in a privileged enough position that if things get really bad, I can leave, which is what I'm doing. Mm-hmm. So I expect that I will be having more sort of political engagement when I return to Canada and can actually engage in politics as a citizen as opposed to just a resident.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly. Yeah, and that brings us up to like the kind of more or less the end of the run, right? Like, well, the second to last, Designing Freedom, episode 31, where we read Stafford Beer's book of the same name, which is actually the notes to a series of lectures. Not really a book, but is also like quite a nice read. Yeah, this feels like it was very important stuff as well, right? Like particularly the points about like the frailty and insufficiency of our current institutions, right? Like, and he manages to frame that critique in cybernetic terms, right? In terms of variety and variety engineering and stability, like this notion of cybernetic homeostasis, where a system is like dynamically stable and is able to respond to challenges from its environment. But that like our institutions aren't. They aren't fucking able to do that, and we're living the evidence of that right now. So I mean, like what's kind of remarkable is that like Stafford was writing this stuff in the 70s, this is also something I notice in general with his writing, that he writes about things in the 60s and the 70s that are like imminently familiar now, as if nothing has improved in the intervening years.
Yeah, that's very true. It certainly diagnosed some deep problems. And I mean, I think an interesting point that is brought up in that lecture series is that, like, yeah, homeostasis is a thing that we often think about in rather positive terms because we are bodies that need to be homeostatically viable to survive. But you know, he makes the good point that, like, in the case of a poorly adapted bureaucracy, superstability or homeostasis can actually be quite negative. So we have to it was interesting to sort of think through those ideas about systems that are quite stable and persistent, but actually in a very detrimental way to their environment.
Yeah, it's bad stuff. But like the other thing that sort of stands out to me with that episode is that, like, or I suppose with that book, is that there was a lot of resonance with transforming technology, right? Like this argument for like one of the chapter titles is Science in the Service of Man. That like kind of making a very similar argument to what Feinberg was making, but in 20 pages instead of 300. Which I found kind of interesting. Definite thematic resonance. And yeah, then the last episode we just recorded, episode 32, the inherent instability of disordered systems. That was a bit of an experiment as well. It was a little bit outside of our normal sort of set of things that we tend to read. It was a math paper or like a sort of a very heavily mathematical paper for one thing. I think it turned out to be pretty good. But it's sort of like it's hard to tell whether we'll I don't know, like whether it's sort of a good approach, because I think we took a sort of a gloss of the paper, which is what we do when we were reading books, right? Like we don't have time to go through every detail of every paragraph, so we just take the gloss of it. But I think it might have paid to have a bit of a closer reading of the thing, but it was hard to read it closely because it was leaning on sort of mathematical notation that's tough for both of us. So
yeah, I think we were definitely pushing up against the edges of our expertise, our knowledge, I should say, and it was also just a very different style of writing than we're used to covering on the show. So I think, like, there were probably some missteps there. I know there were sort of areas of the argument that I was quite fuzzy on, and I may have spoken more with more assurance about it than I actually should have had. But it very much felt like a first stab at covering that sort of material, and it felt to me like our efforts were somewhat amateurish in maybe the way that the first episode of this series was, because we were doing something rather different, right? And it was outside of what our normal comfort zone was. So I'm sure that people may have some feedback about the episode, and that would be good. And we're going to give some thought about how to cover stuff like that a little bit more adequately in the future. Because, of course, we don't want to be, going through line by line and giving you a description of how the math works, but we do need to kind of gloss it in a maybe different way than we are used to doing articles that are written in plain or academic English.
Yeah, I think part of the problem maybe was I think we're maybe being a bit too harsh on ourselves, but I think it did turn out to be a pretty good episode. But part of the problem perhaps was that the core it felt as if it was making one central point about how relatively disordered systems will take on structure from their environment and thus will kind of fail in a way, like that they won't be viable in their own right. They'll be taking on structure that's imposed on them externally, and I think because the abstract is so clear about that's the point they're going to try and make. I think it was too easy to read the rest of the article in a way that it was just restating the same point over and over again. However, going back to it, I think there is a bit more there that we missed out on, the stuff about how they go from changes in subsections of a system becoming and considering those as changes to the whole system or whatever. I think we sort of glossed over that, but it probably is actually quite important to the argument. Their novel technique for talking about those internal changes in terms of scaled noise, I think, was very interesting when I read it, and it made sense when I read it initially, but I couldn't for the life of me recall what it was about when I was looking through the notes while we were recording. So we kind of skipped over that, and I was like, fuck, I think we missed something actually kind of important there.
It's I mean, it's okay for us to kind of fumble things here and there occasionally, and we'll definitely
well, hey, you got 31 excellent episodes and one dud, right? That's fine.
I feel like our batting average is pretty solid here. So hey, look, we tried something new. It was good. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't outstanding. But we're gonna work on that in the future, and I'm sure there'll be good stuff. Because like I am sensitive to the thing that people have been saying, which is that like you talk a lot about like sort of around cybernetics, and I think in this last period of time we've been able to cover cybernetics a little bit more directly, but we need to kind of figure out where the sweet spot is in terms of our engagement with that subject, because obviously there is a kind of technical mathematical side to it that doesn't lend itself to podcasting, right? And doesn't lend itself to our skill set. So yeah,
no, yeah, I'm dreadful at math. It's quite a different experience from reading an article about tech worker organizing. Like it is quite a different thing. But I guess like going forward, I mean, we'll probably do another retrospective in 30 or 40 episodes from now. But I think going forward, it would be nice to do more of the cybernetics and sort of organizational theory stuff, because like. In part, what we're trying to do is actually like we have quite a few different missions on the show, right? Like one of them is to bring this kind of systemic thinking to Marxists. The other is to bring Marxism to systemic thinkers, or to techies, or to appeal to that sort of intersection of those two circles. I think it would be nice to keep pulling on that tech worker organizing thread, or like the kind of like technology in the workplace, all those kind of implications. I guess like, I mean, is there anything else we need to cover before we wrap up?
I don't think so. I think the only thing I really wanted to mention is that we're going to try to sort of signpost upcoming episodes a little bit better in the future. Yeah. Especially when we're doing readings. If it's a matter of interviews, we're not going to do that because people's schedules are what they are, and we definitely don't want to pressure people or guests into a corner. Or cause any kind of controversy for their personal situation. But in terms of the readings that we schedule, we will try to be a little bit more upfront about that, so that listeners have the time to read some of the reading in advance of the episode, as opposed to after the fact. And that's a great example of like we do like to listen to feedback, and it's nice to have that engagement, and like this means that there are people that are following along, like reading in parallel with what we're reading, essentially, and it's like, oh boy, like that's setting yourself a lot of homework. But if you want to know about it ahead of time, yeah, absolutely, you can know about it ahead of time. So in that spirit, the next episode after this is going to be a book, Platform Capitalism, by Nick Cernishek. Relatively short read and a relatively breezy read, so that's a good opportunity to get ahead of that. And and it is unquestionably, unimpeachably Marxist. So
we want to do more Marxist stuff. Actually, that's the other category I forgot to kind of mention, was that like I'm aware that we've been a little bit light on the Marxian sort of theory stuff, but we should do a bit more.
I mean, I think the last major sort of engagement we had with that was the Feenberg reading, right? And xenofeminism, to an extent, it kind of came up, right? But I think the Feenberg reading was the last one where you had that really substantial discussion of Marx. So, I expect we'll have plenty more of that, and certainly platform capitalism. We're going to have some good old Marxism in there. Yeah.
It's going to be fun. So thanks, listeners, for listening to us on this one. It's been a bit of a long episode, but I really hope that we've been able to tie together some threads and to bring out some stuff that we just haven't had time to talk about during the normal run of the episodes. Actually, maybe this means that we should do retrospectives more often. That, like, we can,
I mean,
maybe.
every 20 episodes.
That might be better, yeah,
like
than maybe every 30. But yeah, it's been fun. Thanks for listening. If you want to catch up with us on the internet, we're on Twitter at GIUnitPod. We're on Facebook as General Intellect Unit. We're on generalintellectunit.net, and we're on all the podcast apps, so like, rate, subscribe, all that kind of stuff. If there's an opportunity to leave a review anywhere, like on iTunes, whatever, maybe think about doing that. Or one of the best, like, there's two really great ways you can help us out, and one is to share the show with your friends or people you think might be interested in this sort of thing, and the other is to head to patreon.com/generalintellectunit and maybe throw us a couple of bucks a month to cover cost of books and hosting the show, the little bits of technical infrastructure we have to deal with.
And in this next period of time, it's in a very meaningful way going to be just contributing to my basic living, as I'll be unemployed for a little while. So it's much appreciated. Nice, and I certainly want to say that I appreciate very much the Patreon contributions that we have received up until this point. I realize it's not an enormous amount of money, but it's a significant amount of money that we've received from listeners, and it is much appreciated. It does help with the show, and these 32 episodes that we produced prior to this, I think the quality was contributed to considerably by those contributions. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. Absolutely, thanks for that. We do appreciate it, and like it has the support, and just knowing that the listeners are there is nice. Like, and it's helped to keep the wind in our sails through some pretty difficult scheduling and reading and all that sort of stuff. But we like producing a good show, and we appreciate that people listen to it. Yeah, cool. Well, I guess that's it for now, and we'll catch you again in a couple of weeks with Platform Capitalism. Thanks for listening as always, and goodbye.
Bye.